The Gilded Cage was not a restaurant. It was a mausoleum of wealth, a silent, gilded cathedral where power was the only deity worshipped. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of old money, expensive leather, and the earthy, almost fungal aroma of shaved truffles that seemed to permeate the dark mahogany walls. Light did not illuminate this space so much as it dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, casting long conspiratorial shadows that danced across the faces of men who moved markets with a single whispered word. Ilara Vance moved through these shadows like a phantom, her black uniform a piece of the darkness, her presence designed to be felt but not seen. Her movements were a study in efficiency and grace, a ballet of silent service as she refilled water glasses crafted from Venetian crystal and cleared plates adorned with remnants of $500 entrees. To the titans of industry and finance she served, she was less a person and more a function, a pair of hands that appeared and disappeared as needed. But beneath the starched collar and the practiced neutrality of her expression, a universe of knowledge and memory burned. A silent testament to a life that had been stolen from her, a life far richer and more brilliant than any of the gilded surfaces in this suffocating room. Within the fortress of her mind, while her hands performed the rote, mechanical tasks of her profession, Ilara was somewhere else entirely. She was back in the hushed, dust-mote-filled archives of Columbia University, the scent of aging paper and bookbinding glue filling her senses. She could almost feel the weight of a rare manuscript in her hands, her fingers tracing the intricate provenance of a 20th-century masterpiece. Her PhD dissertation on the hidden marks of master jewelers was more than an academic pursuit. It was her passion, her entire world. She saw the world, not in dollars and cents, but in history, in artistry, in the stories that objects told. This deep, forensic understanding of beauty and value was her secret, a skill so profound and so useless in her current reality that it felt like a phantom limb, an ache for a part of herself she had been forced to amputate. The contrast was a quiet, daily torture. Her mind, trained to dissect the sublime, was now forced to focus on ensuring the steak knives were aligned perfectly with the forks, a mundane precision that mocked the intellectual rigor she once commanded. Every perfectly folded napkin was a reminder of the academic papers she would never publish, every polite, empty smile a mask for the brilliant mind being slowly suffocated by necessity. The necessity had a name, a face, a history that haunted every waking moment. Her motivation was not ambition or a desire for the wealth that surrounded her. It was the ghost of her mother, Eleanor Vance. The memory was never far, often triggered by the most innocuous things. Tonight, it was the sharp, antiseptic scent of the lemon in a patron's mineral water, a smell that instantly transported her back to the sterile, white-walled room of a long-term care facility. She saw her mother, a woman who had once been a supernova of intellect and innovation, reduced to a fragile shell by a devastating stroke, her brilliant mind trapped behind eyes that could no longer communicate the depth of her thoughts. The stroke had followed the complete financial and professional ruin orchestrated by a man her mother had trusted implicitly. That betrayal had not just stolen their money, it had stolen Eleanor's future, her health, and finally, her life. The mountain of medical debt left behind was a physical weight on Ilara's shoulders, a crushing burden that dictated every choice she made. Working double shifts at the Gilded Cage was not a career. It was a penance, a desperate, grinding effort to honor the memory of the woman who had given her everything by paying off the cost of how much she had lost. The delicate, oppressive balance of the restaurant shattered with his arrival. Alistair Finch did not simply enter a room, he conquered it. The ambient murmur of conversation seemed to dip, the air growing thinner, charged with the energy of a predator entering a new territory. The maître d', a man who regularly greeted senators and foreign dignitaries with unflappable poise, seemed to shrink by an inch, his smile becoming tighter, more strained. Ilara watched from across the dining room, her body tensing instinctively. She had studied men like him for years, but he was a different species of powerful. He wore a custom-tailored suit, that probably cost more than her annual salary, but it was like armor on a brute, failing to conceal the raw, restless insecurity that powered his arrogance. He didn't walk. He strode, his gaze sweeping the room with a look of profound boredom and ownership, as if he were merely inspecting a wing of a museum he had just purchased. He dismissed the maitre d' with a curt nod, not even bothering to make eye contact, his attention already on the investor he was guiding to the best table in the house, a table in Ilara's section. Her heart didn't race. Instead, a familiar, cold stillness settled deep in her gut. It was the calm of a soldier who hears the distant but unmistakable sound of approaching artillery. She approached the table, her professional mask firmly in place, a blank canvas upon which men like Alistair Finch could project their own importance. She offered menus, her voice a soft, neutral murmur that was designed to be ignored. He didn't look at her, speaking his order for a 1982 Bordeaux to his guest, as if she were a voice-activated ordering system. His contempt was a palpable force, an invisible wall he erected between himself and anyone he deemed, quote, service staff. To him, she was not a person, she was an object, a tool for his comfort, and her invisibility was a prerequisite for his satisfaction. Inside, Ilara's mind was a whirlwind of observation. She catalogued the nervous tick in the investor's eye, the way Finch's smile never quite reached his, the subtle, predatory lean he adopted when making a point. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. Ilara continued her duties, pouring the obscenely expensive wine with a steady hand, her movements economical and precise. She was a ghost at their feast, a silent witness to a transaction of power, completely unaware that she was about to become the central act in a drama that had begun decades ago. It happened as she was refilling his water glass. A beam of light from an overhead chandelier struck his hand as he gesticulated, and a flash of brilliant cornflower blue light exploded across her vision. It was the ring. The world around her seemed to warp and bend, the ambient noise of the restaurant dissolving into a dull, distant roar. Her academic mind took over instantly, a reflex she couldn't control. She saw not just a sapphire, but a 12-carat, unheated Ceylon sapphire, its cornflower blue color so pure it was almost ethereal. She recognized the setting immediately, a custom Cartier piece, circa 1988, with its distinctive platinum claws designed to mimic the petals of a night-blooming flower. It was a one-of-a-kind commission, a piece so unique and so intimately familiar that seeing it on his hand was like finding a page from her own diary nailed to a stranger's door. A tremor went through her, a violent, electric shock of recognition that started in her gut and shot up her spine. She froze for a fraction of a second, the heavy crystal pitcher in her hand suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It was her mother's ring. The polished, opulent dining room dissolved, replaced by the warm, sunlit memory of her mother's study 25 years ago. Eleanora Vance, her face alight with triumph and joy, held up her hand to show a young Ilara the very same ring. It was a gift she had bought for herself, a tangible symbol of their first major breakthrough, the successful patenting of the revolutionary software that would become the foundation of a future empire. Eleanora had called it her "To the Stars" ring, a private celebration of her boundless ambition and genius. The inscription on the inner band, Ilara knew, was *ad astra, *to the stars. The memory was so intensely vivid, so filled with the light and hope of that long-lost time, that its collision with the present reality was physically painful. Seeing that sacred object, that monument to her mother's brilliance, wrapped around the thick finger of the man who had destroyed her, was a desecration. It was a trophy of conquest, a spoil of a war he had waged in the shadows. The grief she had managed for years, a dull, constant ache, now sharpened into a blade of pure, incandescent rage. and it took every ounce of her disciplined will to keep the professional mask from cracking. Alistair Finch, a man whose entire existence was predicated on the hierarchies of power, noticed her momentary hesitation. He saw her gaze fixed on his hand, and his insecure mind, incapable of imagining any reality beyond his own, arrived at the most obvious and gratifying conclusion. He saw envy. He saw the lowly waitress, in her cheap uniform, mesmerized by a bauble she could never hope to possess. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his lips. This was an opportunity too perfect to pass up, a chance to reinforce his dominance in front of his guest. He leaned back in his chair, drawing the investor's attention, and then turned his cold eyes on Ilara. His voice was no longer a murmur, it was a pronouncement, loud enough to make the couple at the adjacent table look up. "See something you like?" he boomed, the question not a question at all, but the opening salvo of a public execution. He held up his hand, turning the ring so the sapphire caught the light, making it the centerpiece of his little drama. He was enjoying this, feeding on her presumed humiliation, her silent, powerless position. Ilara said nothing, her training kicking in as she tried to pull her gaze away, to retreat back into the shadows of her role, to simply disappear. But he was not finished with his performance. Her silence was not the deference he required. He wanted total submission. He wanted to grind the moment into the floor. He gestured toward the wine bottle on the table with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of pure, dismissive contempt. "Focus on the wine," he commanded, his voice dripping with condescension, each word a carefully chosen stone meant to injure. Then he delivered the final devastating blow, the line he had probably rehearsed in his mind for moments just like this. "This ring," he said, tapping it with a forefinger for emphasis, "is worth more than your entire bloodline." The words echoed in the sudden, sharp silence that had fallen over their section of the restaurant. The investor let out a short, uncomfortable laugh. But for Ilara, the insult was a key turning in a lock. He hadn't just insulted her, he had insulted her mother, her history, the very bloodline that had funded the ring on his finger and the empire he now commanded. A fury, colder and more solid than anything she had ever felt, began to crystallize in her veins, turning her fear into steel and her grief into a weapon. The invisible waitress was about to find her voice. The air in the gilded cage did not just grow silent, it was actively crushed into a vacuum by the weight of Alistair Finch's insult. For a single suspended heartbeat, Ilara felt nothing. It was a void, a perfect, cold emptiness where the shock should have been. Then, the universe inside her shifted on its axis. The years of practiced subservience, the carefully constructed walls of professional neutrality she had built around her grief, did not crumble, they were vaporized. What was left in their place was not the raw, chaotic heat of anger, but something far more dangerous, the absolute crystalline certainty of a purpose that had been dormant for years. Her breath, which should have hitched in her throat, instead deepened, becoming slow and deliberate, each inhalation drawing strength from the very air that had been meant to suffocate her. Her grip on the heavy crystal water pitcher did not tremble. It became an extension of her will, as steady and unyielding as granite. The invisible waitress, the function, the pair of hands, was gone. In her place stood Eleanor Vance's daughter, and the past was no longer a ghost haunting her. It was a weapon in her hand. Her eyes, which had been trained to remain downcast, to study the patterns of the Persian rug rather than the faces of the powerful, lifted slowly. They met Alistair Finch's gaze directly, and for the first time he was truly seeing her, though he did not yet understand what he was looking at. He saw only a defiance he could not comprehend, an unexpected crack in the social order he so thoroughly commanded. He expected tears, a stammered apology, a hasty retreat. He did not expect the profound, unnerving calm that settled over her features. Inside Ilara's mind, the frantic noise of survival was replaced by the quiet, methodical ticking of a clock. The academic, the researcher, the expert she had been forced to bury, rose to the surface. She was no longer in a restaurant, she was in a laboratory, and the specimen before her was a fraud of the highest order. The insult about her bloodline was not just a personal attack, it was a fatal miscalculation, a piece of flawed data presented by an arrogant fool who had no idea he was speaking to the world's foremost authority on the subject he had just introduced. The time for silence was over. The time for the truth, in all its devastating precision, had arrived. Alistair's smirk remained plastered on his face, a grotesque mask of self-satisfaction, but a flicker of uncertainty had begun to dawn in his eyes. He had expected her to break, but she was holding his gaze with an intensity that felt less like insubordination and more like an assessment. He was being weighed, measured, and found wanting. The investor across from him had stopped pretending to eat, his fork hovering over his plate, his expression a mask of fascinated curiosity. The small stage Alistair had built for his own amusement was suddenly not his own. The spotlight was shifting, and the silence was no longer his to command. Ilara took a small, almost imperceptible step closer to the table, a move that was both an act of service and a subtle seizure of territory. She leaned forward, not in a bow of deference, but as a lecturer might, to draw her audience into a critical point. The scent of expensive wine and seared duck fat filled her nostrils, but it was a distant, irrelevant sensation. All of her focus, every sharpened sense, was aimed at the man before her, the architect of her family's ruin. The words formed in her mind not with passion, but with the cold, irrefutable logic of a proven fact. Her voice, when it came, was unrecognizable. The soft, neutral murmur of the waitress was gone, replaced by a tone of quiet, academic authority. It was clear, perfectly modulated, and carried a weight that made the clinking of distant cutlery seem to fall silent. "It is a beautiful piece," she began, her eyes still locked on his. The statement was so contrary to what was expected, so devoid of the emotion he had tried to provoke, that it caught him completely off guard. She wasn't defending herself. She was critiquing the object of his boast. Her gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, not in submission, but to the ring itself, her eyes scanning it with the swift, practiced analysis of a master appraiser. A Cartier original, circa 1988 if I'm not mistaken. She detailed the piece as if reading from a museum catalog, her words painting a picture of its creation. The setting is a custom commission, designed to hold that specific stone. The platinum claws, meant to evoke the petals of a night-blooming cereus, are a signature of the lead designer from that period, a man who only worked on their most exclusive private orders. The technical precision of her description was a splash of ice water in the heated, arrogant atmosphere Alistair had created. The investor's eyebrows shot up. This was not the response of a humiliated waitress. This was the language of an expert, of someone who belonged in the world of auctions and private collections, not in the service aisle of a restaurant. Alistair's smug expression began to falter, confusion clouding his features. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to dismiss her with another crude remark, but Ilara gave him no opportunity. She continued, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more conspiratorial, drawing both men closer into her web of truth. "The stone itself is the most remarkable feature," she went on, her tone, now one of professional admiration, a 12-carat, unheated Ceylon sapphire. The cornflower blue hue is nearly flawless, indicating it was sourced from the Kuruwita region before the mines were depleted in the early 90s. She was not just describing a ring, she was narrating its soul, its history, its very essence. Each word was a small, sharp chisel, chipping away at the foundation of his lie that this object was merely a symbol of his own wealth. She was reclaiming its story, piece by piece, right in front of him, and he was utterly powerless to stop her. He stared at her, his mind struggling to categorize what was happening. Who was this woman? How could she possibly know these details? His world was one of rigid, predictable hierarchies. The service staff were props, faceless and nameless. They were not supposed to have knowledge. They were not supposed to have a voice. Ilara paused, letting the weight of her expertise settle into the space between them. She had established her credentials. Now she would deliver the killing blow. She leaned in even closer, her voice now a near whisper, a blade of sound intended only for the two men at the table. "But its true value," she said, her eyes finding his again, "isn't in the carats or the setting. It's in the inscription on the inner band." The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. Alistair felt a cold dread begin to creep up his spine. He knew what was inscribed there. He had never spoken of it to anyone. It was a secret, a ghost from a past he had worked so tirelessly to bury, a past he believed was dead and gone. The ring suddenly felt cold and heavy on his finger, a manacle binding him to a history he was about to be confronted with. The words she spoke next were the key to the tomb he had sealed shut decades ago. "Asterisk, ad astra, asterisk," she whispered, the Latin phrase a death knell to his carefully constructed reality. "To the stars." The memory it triggered in Alistair was so violent, so unwelcome, that he physically flinched, as if struck. He was no longer in a gilded restaurant. He was in a cramped, sunlit office, listening to a brilliant, laughing woman explain her dreams of building a company that would reach for the stars. He saw Eleanor Vance's face, alive with a passion he had envied and then extinguished. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly, gray pallor. The investor saw it, his eyes widening in shock and intrigue. He was witnessing not just a bizarre confrontation, but the complete unraveling of a titan. Ilara held his gaze, her own expression unreadable, a mask of cold, implacable justice. She had summoned the ghost, and now she would give it a name, making it real, making it undeniable. The final act of her verbal dismantling was about to be delivered, and she savored the moment, the culmination of years of silent grief and rage. "My mother had excellent taste," she said, her voice returning to a normal, conversational volume, yet each word landed like a hammer blow. The investor's jaw dropped slightly. The connection was made. The puzzle was solved. But Ilara was not finished. She looked directly into Alistair Finch's terrified, disbelieving eyes, and with the calm, steady voice of a judge passing sentence, she delivered the final, world-shattering truth. "You should know," she stated, her words clear and cutting. "Eleanor Vance paid for it." The name he had systematically erased from every corporate document, from every interview, from his own biography. The name of the woman whose genius he had stolen, whose trust he had betrayed, and whose life he had ruined. Hearing it spoken aloud, here, in this temple of his success, by a woman who wore her mother's eyes, was like a physical blow. His entire body went rigid. The carefully maintained facade of the self-made billionaire, the visionary, the titan of tech, shattered into a million pieces, exposing the small, frightened thief hiding beneath. He was exposed, utterly and completely, in front of an associate he was trying to impress. Alistair Finch made a sound, a strangled guttural noise that was half gasp, half groan. The color did not return to his face. Instead, it seemed to sink deeper, leaving his skin looking like old parchment. His hand, the one adorned with the stolen ring, trembled uncontrollably on the white linen tablecloth. He was a statue of a man, frozen in a tableau of pure, unadulterated horror. The investor, a man accustomed to predatory business tactics, looked from Ilara's calm, resolute face to Alistair's crumbling one, and instantly understood. He was witnessing the exhumation of a long-buried crime. He slowly, deliberately placed his own napkin on the table, a clear signal that the meal, and quite possibly the deal, was over. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted. The invisible waitress now commanded the room, while the celebrated CEO had been reduced to a speechless, humiliated fraud. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, for what felt like an eternity. Finch's mind was a maelstrom of panic and rage. He had been unmasked. The ghost he thought he had vanquished had returned in the most impossible, unbelievable form. Humiliation for a man like Alistair was a poison that demanded an immediate antidote, and his only antidote was rage. The shock finally gave way to a volcanic fury. His face contorted, the waxy pallor replaced by a blotchy, furious red. His eyes, wide with terror moments before, now narrowed into slits of pure venom. He couldn't attack the truth, so he would attack the messenger. It was his only move, a desperate, clumsy attempt to regain control, to reassert the power that had been so masterfully stripped from him. He shot his hand up, not with a dismissive flick, but with a violent, stabbing gesture, his finger pointing at Ilara as if it were a weapon. He didn't look for the maître d'. He bellowed his name across the hushed dining room, the sound a brutal violation of the restaurant's sacred quiet. "Marcel, get over here now!" The sound was so raw, so filled with panicked fury, that heads turned at every table. The carefully curated illusion of civilized power was shattered. Marcel, the maître d', rushed to the table, his face a mask of professional concern, though his eyes darted between Ilara and the apoplectic billionaire, sensing a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Alistair didn't wait for him to ask what was wrong. He rose slightly from his chair, his voice a low, vicious snarl that dripped with venom and impotent rage. "She's fired," he spat, the words a desperate act of exorcism. He needed her gone. He needed to erase her, just as he had erased her mother. "Get her out of my sight, now." The command was absolute, a king ordering an execution. He slumped back into his chair, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as if he had just run a marathon. He refused to look at Ilara again, instead staring at his plate with unseeing eyes, as if by ignoring her, he could make the last 2 minutes disappear from existence. He had used the only weapon he had left, his power to destroy a person's livelihood. It was a pathetic, reflexive act, but it was all he had. Ilara felt the words, "she's fired," wash over her, not with the sting of defeat, but with the clean, cold shock of liberation. A strange sense of calm settled over her. She had said what needed to be said. She had spoken the truth that had been silenced for 2 decades. Losing this job, a job she had taken only out of grinding necessity, was not a punishment. It was a release. She looked at Marcel, whose face was a mixture of apology and professional obligation. She simply nodded, a gesture of quiet acceptance. There was no need for a scene. Her work here was done. She turned without another word, her back straight, her steps measured and even. She did not look back at Alistair Finch or his stunned guest. As she walked away from the table, she could feel the eyes of the other diners on her, their whispers a rising tide behind her. She was no longer an invisible part of the decor. For one brief shining moment, she had been the most powerful person in the gilded cage, and the memory of it was a suit of armor. In the staff area, the transition was swift and clinical. She was handed her final paycheck in a stark white envelope. She methodically removed her black uniform, the starched, suffocating fabric that had been her skin for so long, and folded it neatly, placing it in her locker. As she changed back into her own simple clothes, jeans and a worn cotton sweater, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The uniform had been a constant, physical reminder of her reduced circumstances, a costume of servitude. Taking it off felt like shedding a heavy, sorrowful skin. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the waitress. She was Ilara Vance, the daughter of Eleanora Vance, and a fire had been lit within her that no amount of financial desperation could ever extinguish. She closed her locker for the last time, the metallic click echoing the finality of a door closing on one chapter of her life and the beginning of another, far more dangerous, but far more meaningful. 1. The walk out of the restaurant was a surreal journey. She moved through the same opulent hall she had served in just minutes before, but now she was a civilian, a ghost of a different kind. The staff she passed averted their eyes, some with pity, others with a kind of fearful respect. They had all heard the commotion, the raw fury in Alistair Finch's voice. They knew she had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. She pushed through the heavy, ornate doors and stepped out into the cool night air of New York City. The city lights seemed brighter. the sounds of traffic sharper. The world felt different because she was different. The humiliation she had endured had not broken her. It had forged her into something new, something stronger. The grief for her mother was still there, a permanent resident in her heart. But now it was accompanied by a new, powerful companion, a righteous, all-consuming resolve. It was no longer enough to honor her mother's memory. Now she had to reclaim it. She walked for blocks, not heading home, but simply moving through the city's electric pulse, her mind racing. The initial adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, and the cold, hard reality of her situation began to seep in. She was unemployed. The mountain of medical debt remained. The rent was due in a week. A wave of panic, cold and sickening, washed over her, threatening to drown the newfound fire of her resolve. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her precarious existence, the sheer, overwhelming terror of being alone and adrift in a city that had no mercy for the powerless. She leaned against the cold brick of a building, closing her eyes, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar. The image of her mother's face in the final months of her life flooded her mind. The frustration, the sadness, the brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. The memory was a fresh stab of pain, a reminder of everything that had been stolen from them by the man in the restaurant. But then, another memory surfaced, pushing the painful one aside. It was the memory of her mother in her prime, standing in front of a whiteboard covered in complex algorithms, her eyes blazing with intelligence and excitement. She remembered her mother's favorite phrase, the one she had inscribed on the ring, asterisk, ad astra, asterisk to the stars. It was not just a motto, it was a command. It was a promise of resilience, of reaching for something beyond one's grasp, of never, ever giving up. The panic receded, beaten back by the sheer force of her mother's legacy. This was not the end. This was the beginning. Finch had fired a waitress, but he had created an adversary. He thought he had silenced her, but he had just given her a reason to shout from the rooftops. She straightened up, her spine stiffening, her jaw set. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. Determination, sharp and clear, took its place. Justice. That was the only thing that mattered now. She finally turned and began walking home, her steps now filled with purpose. The plan was not yet formed, but its foundation was solid. She knew Finch had built his empire on a lie. She knew he had stolen her mother's work, her patents, her seed money. What she lacked was proof. The world would not take the word of a fired waitress over that of a celebrated billionaire. She needed evidence, hard and irrefutable, that could withstand the scrutiny of the courts and the public. Her mind, the sharp analytical tool she had honed for years in the archives of Columbia, began to work, sifting through possibilities, connecting disparate pieces of information. She was no longer just an art historian, she was a forensic investigator, and the crime scene was 2 decades old. She needed to find the paper trail, the digital ghosts, the cracks in the fortress of lies Alistair Finch had built around himself, and she knew she couldn't do it alone. As she walked, a name from the past surfaced in her memory, a name connected to the chaotic, painful days of her mother's collapse. Arthur Abernathy. He was her mother's old estate lawyer, a quiet, meticulous man who had been pushed aside by Finch's high-powered legal team during the hostile takeover. Ilara remembered him being kind, his eyes filled with a sad, frustrated sympathy. He had always believed Eleonora had been cheated, but Finch's lawyers had buried him and his small firm in an avalanche of paperwork and legal threats, until he was forced to stand down. He was retired now, she thought, but he was a link to that time. He was a witness. He might remember details, names, documents that could provide a starting point. He was the first thread she could pull, the first potential crack in Alistair Finch's perfectly constructed world. The hope was a fragile thing, but it was enough to light her way through the dark city streets. Reaching her small, cramped apartment, the contrast with the gilded cage was almost comical. There was no mahogany, no crystal, only second-hand furniture and stacks of books that threatened to take over the entire space. But tonight, it did not feel like a cage of poverty. It felt like a command center, a war room. She went straight to a dusty, forgotten box in the back of her closet, a box labeled Mom's Papers. Inside, beneath old tax returns and sentimental cards, was an old, leather-bound address book. Her fingers, trembling slightly, flipped through the brittle, yellowed pages. And there it was, Abernathy, Arthur. An address and a phone number, written in her mother's elegant, looping script. It was a voice from the past, a connection to the life that had been stolen, and a potential key to the future. She stared at the number, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the first real step. She took a deep breath and picked up her phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the warmth of the old leather book. She dialed the number, half expecting it to be disconnected, a dead end before she had even begun. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring was an eternity, stretching her nerves taut. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would explain the impossible story of what had just happened. Then, just as she was about to lose hope, a voice answered. It was older, a little gravelly, but sharp and clear. Abernathy. It was him. The sound of his voice was like a bridge, suddenly appearing across a chasm. Her own voice was unsteady at first, a stranger in her own throat as she identified herself, the words tumbling out in a rush. Mr. Abernathy, my name is Alara Vance. I'm Eleanor Vance's daughter. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Alara held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. She could hear the old lawyer's mind working, connecting the name to a painful, unresolved case from his past. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, tinged with a weary sadness. Eleonora's daughter, he repeated quietly. I am so sorry for your loss. Your mother was a brilliant woman, a true visionary. The genuine respect in his voice, the acknowledgement of her mother's genius, was something Alara had not heard in years. It broke through her composure, and for the first time that night, tears welled in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of gratitude. She had found someone who remembered. She had found an ally. She quickly composed herself, the tears vanishing as quickly as they had come, replaced by the cold fire of her mission. She began to speak, laying out the events of the evening, her voice growing stronger and more confident with every word. She told him everything. About the restaurant, about Alistair Finch, about the cruel boast, and about the ring. She described the inscription, asterisk, ad astra, asterisk, and she could almost hear the old lawyer's sharp intake of breath over the phone. She told him how Finch had fired her on the spot, how he had looked at her with the eyes of a man seeing a ghost. She explained that she knew, with every fiber of her being, that he had built his entire empire on the foundations of her mother's work, and that she was no longer willing to let that lie stand. She finished, her heart pounding, and waited for his response. She was prepared for skepticism, for him to tell her that it was too late, that Finch was too powerful, that she was a waitress with no resources against a man who could buy armies of lawyers. She was prepared for him to tell her to let it go, to move on with her life. But Arthur Abernathy did not say any of those things. There was another long silence, and then he spoke, his voice no longer just sad, but hard, with an edge of old, unforgotten anger. I always knew it, he said, his voice low and intense. I knew he robbed her blind, but I could never find the proof. His team was too good. They created a paper trail that was a fortress. He paused again, and Alara could picture him in his study, surrounded by old law books, a fire long thought extinguished being rekindled. Miss Vance, he said, his voice now firm, resolute. For 20 years I have regretted not being able to do more for your mother. I believe you. And I believe the arrogance of a man like Alistair Finch may have finally given us a way to tear that fortress down. The words were the most beautiful sound Alara had ever heard. They were the sound of hope, of possibility, of justice. There was a storage unit, Abernathy continued, his mind already working, pulling on threads from 2 decades ago. After the bankruptcy, we had to put all of Eleanor's personal and professional effects somewhere. Old hard drives, boxes of research notes, prototype schematics. Finch's lawyers seized all the official corporate assets, but they never bothered with her personal archives. They probably thought it was worthless junk. He let out a dry chuckle. The arrogance of that man. He never respected her mind, only what he could take from it. He gave her the address of the storage facility in Queens, a place she hadn't thought about in years. "I still have the key and the access codes," he said. "Meet me there tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp. We're going to go through every last piece of paper, every last byte of data. We are going to find the truth you've always known was there." Alara hung up the phone, her hand trembling not from fear but from a surge of powerful, exhilarating energy. She had a plan, she had an ally, she had a destination. The fight was no longer a vague, desperate hope. It was a concrete mission. She looked around her small apartment, at the stacks of books and the photo of her smiling mother on the mantelpiece. For years, this place had felt like a shelter from her grief. Tonight, it had become the headquarters for a war she was about to wage. Alistair Finch thought he had extinguished a minor annoyance by firing a waitress. He had no idea that he had just armed a historian with a cause, ignited a daughter's fury, and awakened a ghost from the past that was now coming to collect a debt that was 20 years overdue. The hunt for justice had officially begun. The next morning, the sun that rose over Queens was a pale, watery thing, a stark contrast to the gilded, artificial light of the previous evening. The address Arthur Abernathy had given her led to a place that was the absolute antithesis of the gilded cage. It was a sprawling, soulless complex of corrugated steel and faded blue paint, a necropolis of forgotten belongings where people stored the pieces of lives they no longer had room for. The air smelled of damp concrete, exhaust fumes from the nearby expressway, and the faint, metallic tang of rust. Ilara stood before the designated unit, her breath misting in the chilly air, feeling a profound sense of dislocation. This cold, impersonal box held the last tangible remnants of her mother's brilliant, vibrant life. It felt like a violation, a final, quiet indignity that the sum of Eleanor Vance's genius was now relegated to a 10 by 20-foot cage of metal and dust. She clutched the strap of her bag. The worn leather, a small comfort against the overwhelming sense of trespassing on sacred ground. The weight of the past was a physical presence here, pressing in on her from all sides. Arthur Abernathy arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, his old but immaculate sedan pulling up quietly. He was smaller than she remembered, his shoulders stooped with age, but his eyes, when they met hers, were as sharp and clear as she recalled. They held a spark of intellectual fire that time had not managed to extinguish, and a deep, weary kindness that instantly put her at ease. He carried a worn leather briefcase and moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who measured his life in carefully considered actions rather than wasted movements. He offered her a small, sad smile, a silent acknowledgement of the painful journey they were about to undertake together. There were no lengthy pleasantries. The gravity of their purpose hung between them, a shared understanding that transcended the need for small talk. He simply nodded toward the heavy, roll-up door of the storage unit, a silent signal that it was time to begin. He produced a set of old, tarnished keys, the sound of them jingling in the quiet morning air seeming unnaturally loud, like the unlocking of a tomb. The lawyer worked the lock with a practiced, steady hand. It was stiff from years of disuse, and the groan of protest it made as the mechanism finally turned was a sound of deep, metallic complaint. With a shared effort, they heaved the heavy corrugated door upward. It rattled and shook in its tracks, a cloud of dust and debris raining down on them as it ascended, revealing the darkness within. A single, bare light bulb flickered to life when Arthur pulled a dangling chain, casting a weak yellow glow over the scene. The sight that greeted Alara made her breath catch in her throat. The unit was filled, floor to ceiling, with cardboard boxes, stacked in precarious towers that leaned against each other for support. They were covered in a thick, uniform blanket of gray dust, the silent accumulation of 2 decades of neglect. On the side of each box, in her mother's familiar, elegant handwriting, were labels: Research Notes, Project Chimera, Financials 1995 to 1998. Personal correspondence. It was a physical archive of a life, a career, a dream, all packed away and forgotten by the world. It was her mother's mind, disassembled and entombed in cardboard. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply stood at the threshold, breathing in the stale, dead air of the past. To Ilara, it felt like standing on the edge of an archaeological dig, the ruins of a lost civilization laid out before her. Each box was a potential artifact, each piece of paper a clue. But the sheer volume of it was staggering, a mountain of forgotten history that seemed impossible to scale. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her resolve. Where could they possibly begin? How could they find a single crucial piece of evidence in this chaotic mausoleum of data? It was a task that felt Herculean in its scope, and for a terrifying second, she felt the same crushing hopelessness that had defined her life for the past several years. The fire that had been lit the night before flickered, threatened by the cold, dusty reality of the task ahead. She felt small and powerless again, just a daughter standing before the impossible weight of her mother's legacy. Arthur, as if sensing her hesitation, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. He did not offer empty words of encouragement. Instead, he spoke with the calm, methodical voice of a strategist surveying a battlefield. He pointed toward a specific stack of boxes in the corner, ones that looked more securely taped, more organized than the others. Finch's lawyers were thorough, but they were arrogant, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. They took what they saw as valuable: corporate records, patent filings, official bank statements. They left what they considered personal clutter. They wouldn't have wasted their billable hours sifting through her research notes or personal hard drives. They saw a woman, not a genius. That is where we will find their mistake. His words cut through her despair, replacing it with a renewed sense of focus. He was right. Finch's greatest weakness, the one he had displayed so vividly in the restaurant, was his inability to see the value in people he deemed beneath him. He had underestimated Eleonora in life, and he had underestimated the legacy she left behind in death. With a shared sense of purpose, they began. The first few hours were a grueling exercise in physical labor and mounting frustration. They moved the heavy boxes out into the corridor, the cardboard groaning under the weight of old paper. The dust was suffocating, coating their clothes and hands, filling their lungs with the dry, musty scent of decay. They opened the first box, labeled Financials, and found exactly what Arthur had predicted: old utility bills, canceled checks for groceries, personal tax returns from years before she had even met Alistair Finch. It was the mundane detritus of a life, heartbreakingly normal and utterly useless for their cause. Ilara's hands, accustomed to the delicate work of handling ancient manuscripts, were soon smudged with dirt and sore from tearing at packing tape. Each empty lead felt like a small failure, a confirmation of the fear that this was a fool's errand, that the proof they sought had been destroyed, or was simply never recorded in the first place. They moved through box after box, the pile of discarded documents growing around them. They found old photographs of a smiling, vibrant Eleonora, a sight that sent a fresh pang of grief through Ilara's heart. They found drafts of academic papers she had written in college, her brilliant mind already evident in the complex theories she explored. They found letters from friends and family. It was an intimate, painful journey through her mother's life, a life that felt a million miles away from the corporate treachery they were trying to uncover. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent, the light outside the storage unit shifting from the bright white of midday to the warm orange of late afternoon. Fatigue began to set in, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was as much emotional as it was physical. The initial hope of the morning had been ground down by the relentless, fruitless reality of the search. Ilara sat back on her heels, surrounded by a sea of paper, and allowed a single, silent tear of frustration to trace a path through the grime on her cheek. Just as the last vestiges of her resolve were beginning to crumble, Arthur let out a low, sharp exclamation. "Here," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. He was holding not a piece of paper, but a heavy beige-colored object that was a relic of a bygone technological era. It was an old external hard drive, a clunky plastic brick from the late 1990s. Taped to its surface was a yellow sticky note, the adhesive long since failed, but the note itself preserved. On it, in her mother's handwriting, was a single word: Prometheus. Ilara's heart leaped. Prometheus was the internal codename for the revolutionary software her mother had designed, the very software that had become the foundation of Finch Dynamics. It was the project she had been working on when Alistair Finch entered her life. This was not just a random piece of hardware, it was a time capsule, a digital vault that might contain the very heart of her mother's work and, just possibly, the evidence of its theft. Their excitement was immediately tempered by a new, daunting challenge. The hard drive used a SCSI interface, a connection that had been obsolete for more than 2 decades. They had no way to access the data it contained. A frantic search through the remaining boxes yielded a tangled mess of old cables and power adapters, but nothing that would connect this digital fossil to a modern computer. The feeling of being so close, yet so far, was a unique form of torture. They had the treasure chest, but the key was lost to the relentless march of technology. For a moment it seemed they had hit another dead end, a technological wall that was just as insurmountable as a legal one. The hope that had surged through Ilara just moments before now curdled into a bitter, metallic taste of disappointment in the back of her throat. It felt like the universe was taunting them, showing them the truth but refusing them the means to grasp it. Arthur, however, was not a man easily defeated by logistics. His mind, trained in the art of finding solutions to complex problems, was already working. He pulled out his phone, his old, gnarled fingers, surprisingly nimble as they tapped on the screen. He made a call to a former client of his, a man who ran a specialized data recovery service in the city, a digital archaeologist of sorts, who specialized in resurrecting information from dead and obsolete technology. He explained the situation in calm, precise terms, his voice conveying the urgency of their request without a hint of panic. Ilara listened, her hope rekindling with every word. There was a chance. It was a slim, expensive chance, but it was a chance nonetheless. The data recovery expert agreed to see them immediately, recognizing the name of the once prominent lawyer and sensing the importance of the task. Their dusty, frustrating day in the storage unit was over. The hunt was moving to a new, more promising front. The data recovery lab was a world away from the storage unit. It was a clean, sterile environment filled with the low hum of servers and the blinking lights of complex machinery. It smelled of ozone and clean electricity. Their expert, a man named Ben, who looked far too young to be an expert in anything, handled the old hard drive with the reverence of a museum curator handling a priceless artifact. He listened intently as Ilara and Arthur explained what they were looking for, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to genuine intrigue. He made no promises, warning them that a drive that had been dormant for 20 years could be irretrievably corrupted. The platters could be damaged, the data degraded into a meaningless digital soup. He told them it would take time, possibly days, to even know if recovery was possible. The waiting began, an agonizing period of limbo where Ilara's entire future, her entire quest for justice, hung on the fragile magnetic state of a 2-decade-old piece of metal. For 3 days, Ilara lived in a state of suspended animation. She barely ate, she barely slept. She paced the confines of her small apartment, her phone clutched in her hand, waiting for a call that could either be a new beginning or a final, crushing end. Every passing hour felt like a year, stretching her nerves to their breaking point. Arthur called to check on her, his calm, steady voice a lifeline in her sea of anxiety. He reminded her to be patient, that they had come further than they had any right to expect. But patience felt like an impossible luxury. The image of Alistair Finch's smug, cruel face was burned into her mind, a constant fuel for her impatient fury. She wanted the proof. She needed the weapon that would finally allow her to fight back, to reclaim the narrative that he had so completely and callously stolen from her mother. The waiting was a form of torture, a silent, nerve-shredding battle against the encroaching forces of doubt and despair. On the fourth day, the call finally came. It was Ben. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs as she answered, her throat suddenly dry. Ben's voice was calm, but she could detect an undercurrent of excitement that made her own hope surge. "We got it," he said, the 3 words sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through her body. The drive was in surprisingly good condition. "We've cloned the entire contents. You can come and see for yourselves." The relief was so overwhelming, so total, that Ilara's knees felt weak. She sank into a chair, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. They had done it. They had breached the walls of the past. The ghost in the machine was about to speak. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her bones, that it was going to tell them everything they needed to hear. The final piece of the puzzle was within their grasp. Back in the sterile, quiet lab, they sat before a large monitor while Ben navigated the resurrected file system. It was like looking at a digital ghost, an operating system from a forgotten era. He clicked open a folder labeled Partnership, and inside were dozens of documents. One file name stood out: Finch_Vance_Agreement_Final_Draft.doc. Ilara held her breath as Ben opened it. On the screen appeared the original, undoctored partnership agreement between Eleanor Vance and Alistair Finch. It was all there, in black and white, laid out in precise legal language. Eleanor was the majority partner, the controlling interest, the sole owner of the core intellectual property. The document they were looking at was a world away from the one Finch's lawyers had produced during the takeover, the one that had relegated Eleanor to a minority stakeholder, effectively erasing her control and her ownership. This was it. This was the smoking gun. Arthur Abernathy stared at the screen, his face grim, his eyes blazing with a cold, righteous anger. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. "He forged it. The man forged the entire basis of his career." He pointed to a specific clause on the screen, his finger trembling slightly with rage. "This is the original IP clause. It assigns all patent rights to Eleanor, licensing them to the partnership. The version he used in court assigned them to the corporate entity, which he then controlled." The sheer audacity of the crime, the cold, calculated betrayal it represented, was breathtaking. He had not just outmaneuvered her in business, he had committed a felony, a brazen act of forgery that had laid the foundation for his entire billion-dollar empire. The proof was no longer a matter of suspicion or conjecture. It was here, undeniable, displayed in the stark, unforgiving pixels of a computer screen. But there was more. Ben, sensing their focus, navigated to another folder, this one ominously labeled Correspondence_AF. Inside was a chain of emails, a one-sided conversation from Alistair Finch to a lawyer at a notoriously ruthless corporate law firm. Ilara began to read, her blood running cold as she absorbed the words. The emails laid out his entire plan, step by step, with a chilling lack of emotion. He detailed his strategy to dilute Eleanor's shares, to create a false paper trail of her alleged mismanagement, and to use a series of shell corporations to hide his transfer of her core patents into his own name. He spoke of her not as his partner, but as an obstacle to be managed and removed. It was a cold-blooded blueprint for a corporate assassination, written with the detached precision of a sociopath. He had documented his own crime, so confident in his ability to bury it that he had left a perfect, damning record of his own villainy. Reading those emails was the most painful moment of Ilara's life. It was one thing to know her mother had been betrayed. It was another to see the betrayal in the architect's own words, to witness the cold, methodical dismantling of her mother's life and dreams. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. But beneath the grief, the fire of her rage burned hotter and brighter than ever before. This was no longer just about justice for her mother. This was about exposing a predator, a man who built his throne on the bones of a brilliant woman he had systematically destroyed. The evidence was not just a legal tool, it was a moral imperative. She looked at Arthur, her eyes shining with unshed tears and a terrifying, unshakable resolve. She finally had the weapon. Now, she just needed to choose the battlefield. They left the lab with a secured copy of the entire hard drive, a small, modern flash drive that contained enough evidence to utterly annihilate Alistair Finch. The weight of it in her pocket felt immense, a concentration of truth so potent it was almost radioactive. Back in Arthur's quiet, book-lined office, the final stage of the plan began to take shape. A simple lawsuit, Arthur explained, would be a mistake. Finch would use his immense wealth to bury them in legal motions, to drag the process out for years, bleeding them dry of resources and hope. He would paint Alara as a disgruntled, fame-seeking former employee. They would lose the war of public opinion before the first legal shot was even fired. They needed a stage. They needed to deliver the blow in a place where he was at his most powerful, his most arrogant, and his most vulnerable, in front of the very people whose faith in him was the source of his power. The annual Finch Dynamics shareholder meeting. The idea dawned on them both at almost the same moment. It was in 2 weeks. It was the one day of the year when Alistair Finch presented himself to the world as a visionary, a leader, a titan of industry. It was his coronation, a carefully stage-managed event broadcast to every major financial news network on the planet. To expose him, there would not be a quiet legal filing. It would be a public execution. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy, a single all-or-nothing gambit. But it was the only move that matched the scale of his crimes. It was the only way to ensure the truth was not just heard, but that it echoed around the world, shattering the myth of Alistair Finch in a single catastrophic moment. The audacity of the plan was terrifying, but it felt right. It was a plan her mother, a woman who had always thought on a grand scale, would have appreciated. The final piece of the puzzle was access. They needed a way into the high-security event, and they needed a voice. Arthur Abernathy, after a long and thoughtful pause, picked up his phone. He made another call, this time to a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a tenacious, investigative journalist he had once helped with a pro bono case years ago. He had saved her career, and she owed him a debt of loyalty. Arthur laid out the story in broad, compelling strokes, emphasizing the trove of irrefutable evidence they now possessed. He offered her the exclusive, the biggest corporate scandal story of the decade. Sarah, her journalistic instincts firing on all cylinders, didn't hesitate. She agreed to meet them, to vet the evidence, and if it was as solid as he claimed, to provide Alara with the press credentials she would need to get into the meeting. The final ally was in place. The trap was set. Alara walked home that evening under a sky full of stars, the city lights of Manhattan glittering in the distance. For the first time, she looked at them not as distant, unattainable symbols of wealth and power, but as a destination. Asterisk. Ad astra. Asterisk to the stars. She was no longer a waitress, no longer a victim, no longer a grieving daughter lost in the shadows. She was the inheritor of a brilliant legacy and the instrument of a long-delayed justice. She had the truth in her pocket, she had powerful allies by her side, and she had a plan that was as audacious and ambitious as the mother she was fighting to honor. In 2 weeks, Alistair Finch would stand on a global stage, ready to celebrate himself. He would have no idea that among the crowd of adoring shareholders and fawning press, a ghost from his past was waiting, holding a mirror that would show him, and the entire world, the monster he truly was. The final confrontation was coming. The checkmate was prepared. The grand ballroom of the Sheraton Times Square was a universe away from the gilded cage. Yet it was constructed from the same essential elements: power, money, and a suffocating lack of oxygen for anyone deemed unimportant. It was a vast, cavernous space, bathed in the cold blue-white light of the Finch Dynamics corporate logo, a stylized phoenix that seemed to mock the very idea of rising from ashes. The air was thick with the scent of ambition, a sterile, almost metallic odor that clung to the tailored suits and expensive perfumes of the hundreds of shareholders and journalists in attendance. They were here for the annual coronation of their king, Alistair Finch, who stood on a massive stage, dwarfed by a 40-foot screen projecting his confident, smiling face. He was in his element, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that boomed from the state-of-the-art sound system, speaking of vision, integrity, and a future he claimed to have single-handedly forged from the fires of innovation. Ilara Vance sat in the press section, a small still point in the swirling galaxy of corporate self-congratulation. She was no longer wearing a uniform of servitude, but a simple, dark blazer, an armor of professional anonymity. Inside, however, she was a supernova of terror and resolve, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Arthur sat 2 rows behind her, a silent, steady presence, while Sarah Jenkins, the journalist, was positioned near the tech booth, her own expression a mask of predatory calm. Ilara focused on Finch's voice, letting his arrogant words become the fuel for the fire she was about to unleash. He was building his own funeral pyre, and she was holding the match. The moment came as they knew it would, after the thunderous, obligatory applause following his speech. The floor was opened for the Q&A session, a carefully managed piece of theater where pre-vetted journalists asked softball questions that allowed Finch to further burnish his own myth. The first question was asked, then the second. Ilara felt a wave of nausea, the cold dread of the soldier in the trench waiting for the whistle. Her entire life, her mother's legacy, the future she had never allowed herself to dream of, all hinged on the next few seconds. She felt Arthur's gaze on the back of her neck, a silent encouragement. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the sterile air burning her lungs. Then, she stood. The simple act of rising to her feet felt like lifting a mountain. Her legs trembled, but they held. She began the long, terrifying walk to the microphone positioned in the center aisle. Each step was a battle against the screaming voice in her head that told her to turn back, to run, to disappear back into the shadows where she had lived for so long. The faces in the crowd turned toward her, a sea of curious, indifferent expressions. She could feel Alistair Finch's gaze from the stage, a look of mild, impatient annoyance at this unscheduled interruption. He did not recognize her. To him, she was just another faceless component of the crowd, a momentary distraction from his glory. She reached the microphone, its cold metallic surface a shock to her trembling fingers. She gripped it, grounding herself in the reality of the moment. The time for being a ghost was over. She cleared her throat, the sound echoing unnaturally in the vast, silent hall. She looked past the blinding stage lights, directly at the silhouette of the man who had destroyed her family. Her voice, when it came, was not the whisper of a waitress or the trembling plea of a victim. It was the clear, steady tone of an academic presenting an irrefutable thesis, a voice that carried the weight of 2 decades of silenced truth. "Mr. Finch," she began, her words slicing through the corporate hum. "My name is Ilara Vance." The name hung in the air, an unexploded ordnance. On the massive screen, Alistair Finch's magnified face registered the impact in slow, agonizing detail. The confident, practiced smile did not falter, but it froze, becoming a grotesque rictus. A flicker of confusion entered his eyes, a momentary neurological misfire as his brain struggled to place the name. Then, as the connection was made, a wave of recognition so profound, so utterly horrifying, washed over him. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor under the harsh stage lights. He knew the name, and he knew the face. It was the face of the waitress, the face he had tried to erase from his memory, and it was the face of her mother, a ghost he had believed long since buried. A low murmur rippled through the auditorium, a wave of collective confusion as hundreds of people sensed the sudden, dramatic shift in the atmosphere. The carefully controlled narrative of the day had just been irrevocably broken. Before Finch could recover, before his security detail could react, before he could utter a single word of denial, the second phase of the attack was launched. Sarah Jenkins gave a subtle nod to the technician at the audio-visual controls, a young man whose own father had been ruined by a Finch Dynamics takeover years ago. With a few keystrokes, the 40-foot screen behind Alistair Finch was hijacked. The triumphant, smiling image of the CEO vanished, replaced by a stark, side-by-side display of two documents. On the left, a scanned image of the original partnership agreement, its pages filled with Eleanor Vance's elegant signature and clauses that clearly defined her as the majority owner and holder of all intellectual property. On the right, the forged document Finch had used in court, a crude and arrogant counterfeit, with her signature clumsily replicated and the critical ownership clauses rewritten to erase her completely. Alara's voice filled the stunned silence, providing the narration for the damning evidence displayed for the world to see. "You speak of vision, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute truth, "but you stole yours from the woman who funded you. You speak of integrity, but you built this entire company on a foundation of forgery and fraud." She paused, letting the weight of her accusations settle. "You built your empire on a lie that destroyed my mother, Eleanor Vance." The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A collective, audible gasp swept through the ballroom, a sound like the sea pulling back before a tsunami. The flashes of press cameras began to strobe relentlessly, turning the scene into a frantic, chaotic tableau of light and shadow. On the stage, Alistair Finch visibly crumbled. The titan of industry was gone, replaced by a cornered, terrified thief. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. He looked to the board member seated behind him, his eyes pleading for support, for an escape, but they recoiled from him as if he were contagious, their faces masks of horror and betrayal. They were not seeing a leader. They were seeing the man who had just vaporized billions of dollars of their shareholder value. His image was still projected on smaller screens throughout the hall, a close-up of a man utterly undone, his face slick with sweat, his eyes wide with the sheer, unadulterated panic of a king being dethroned in a bloody, public coup. He was stripped of his power, his reputation, his carefully constructed myth, all in the space of a single, devastating minute. The phoenix on his corporate logo now seemed like a cruel joke, for there would be no rising from these ashes. This was not a setback. It was an extinction-level event. Alara stood at the microphone, watching the complete and total implosion of the man who had haunted her life. The roaring in her ears subsided. The frantic beating of her heart slowed. The incandescent rage that had fueled her for so long did not vanish, but it cooled, crystallizing into a profound, quiet sense of peace. The immense weight she had carried on her shoulders for 20 years, the burden of her mother's stolen legacy and her own suffocated potential, simply dissolved. It was done. The truth, in all its terrible and beautiful power, was free. She watched as two grim-faced security guards, taking their cues from a frantic board member, moved toward Alistair, flanking him, their presence a clear signal that his reign was over. He didn't resist. He was a hollow man, a puppet with his strings cut, and they escorted him off the stage, away from the glare of the lights and the judgment of the world he had so desperately sought to conquer. As he disappeared into the wings, Alara knew she was not just witnessing the fall of a man, but the vindication of a brilliant woman whose name would now, finally, be remembered. Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth. The aftermath was a storm of glorious chaos. As Alara slipped away from the microphone, Sarah Jenkins's team was already uploading the mountain of evidence to every major news outlet on the planet. By the time Alara and Arthur stepped out of the hotel and into the crisp autumn air of the city, the story was the #1 headline across the globe. The Finch Dynamics stock was an absolute freefall and after-hours trading, a vertical line of red that represented the complete evisceration of a corporate myth. News vans were already swarming the hotel entrance, Their satellite dishes pointed to the sky, broadcasting the scandal to the world. Alistair Finch was facing a firestorm of federal investigations for fraud, a tidal wave of civil lawsuits from shareholders, and the complete and utter ruin of his personal and professional life. Arthur placed a steadying hand on Ilara's shoulder, his old eyes shining with a fierce, vindicated light. They didn't need to speak. In the shared, quiet moment amidst the swirling chaos, they both knew. The debt had been paid in full. The ghost of Eleanora Vance could finally rest. Months later, the city looked different to Ilara. The towering skyscrapers no longer seemed like monuments to a power she could never touch, but like possibilities. The gilded cage was a distant, painful memory, a chapter from someone else's life. She sat not in a cramped apartment filled with dusty books, but in a bright, spacious office, with a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the Hudson River. The invitation had come from a place she never expected. The board of a rival technology firm, led by a CEO named Anya Sharma, who had been a quiet admirer of Eleanora's early work, had been profoundly moved by Ilara's story. They had not seen a vengeful daughter, they had seen a brilliant researcher with unshakable integrity. They had created a new position just for her, Director of Corporate Archives and Legacy, a role designed to protect the company's intellectual history and ensure that the contributions of its innovators, particularly women, would never be erased or forgotten. She was finally using her mind, her passion for history and truth, not for survival, but for a purpose that resonated with every fiber of her being. On her desk, next to a state-of-the-art computer, sat a single framed photograph of her mother, smiling, her eyes full of the light that Alistair Finch had tried, and failed, to extinguish. Ilara's journey had been forged in the shadows of grief and necessity, a long, painful odyssey, from a gilded cage of servitude to this sunlit office of purpose. She had learned that a legacy is not built from stolen patents or forged documents, but from the indelible mark left on the world by a brilliant mind and a courageous heart. Alistair Finch had tried to seize the stars for himself by blotting out her mother's light, and in the end he had been consumed by his own darkness. Ilara, by honoring that same light, had found her own way to the stars, creating a future that not only reclaimed the past, but ensured its truth would shine forever. If Ilara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.